Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi visited Damascus about 2 weeks ago for talks with his counterpart, Syrian President Bashar Al-Assad. The main issues were economic, but the visit, the first since the Syrian civil war erupted a dozen years ago, also signaled Tehran's growing influence over the Assad regime, secondary only to the Russian role in the war-torn country's affairs. At the same time, Syrian and Iranian officials huddled with their Russian and Turkish colleagues, while moderate Arab nations met in Jordan to call for Syria's readmission to the Arab League. Do all these simultaneous contacts signal a general rapprochement between Tehran and most Arab capitals, or a more modest move to exploit, of course, the Syrian dependence for Iran's benefit? Joining us to analyze this matter from Central Israel is Dr. Amir, who is an Iran lecturer at Watchmen University. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us from Ankara, Turkey, is Mr. Omer Iskizilchik, who is a foreign policy and security analyst. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Thanks for having me.
With me in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding of the current state of play of Iran in Syria.
So historically, of course, because of the common enmity with Iraq, which is between Iran and Syria, perhaps going back to Assyria and Persia, along with Babylon, that's for historians to say. But in modern times, obviously, there was some good connection between Iran and Syria regarding their common enemy, Iraq. Of course, following the Iranian Revolution, and because the Alawite minority to which the Assad family belongs is considered affiliated, at least, with the Shiites, there was an even tighter connection. Now, with what you described as several developments simultaneously, the question is, if Syria is back in the fold, if Bashar Assad is now considered a semi-legitimate Arab leader, even the Jordanians, against American wishes, and the United States, of course, supports the Hashemite kingdom. Without American support, Jordan cannot survive. Even against American wishes, Jordan took part in it. One should consider the fact that Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other Arab countries could compete with Iran for influence over Assad. So what we have seen right now is only the first move in a very intricate ploy which is still unfolding.
Dr. Javan, if I may, what is the Iranian attitude towards Syria, considering the fact that it has been heavily invested for quite some time now in the war-torn country, and has been even more so invested in trying to bolster its own presence there, be it by its advisors as well as various proxies, including particularly the Fatimiyun brigades, which have brought also with them all the families from Afghanistan and try to increase the Shiite presence in the area of Al-Mayadin, Abu Kamal, and other areas throughout Syria.
Thank you very much for having me. If I can just make one note in relation to what Mr. Amir Oren said. In 1974, Imam Musa Assad, the missing Imam Musa Assad, who was the leader of the Shia in Lebanon, officially recognized the Alawites in Syria as Shia. So this is now, it's officially recognized and as part of the religion, which is why another reason why the Iranian regime feels an affinity for the Assad regime, although it's not the only reason. I would have to say, please don't be fooled by the smiles and the warm words of President Raisi when he was in Syria. The Islamic Republic of Iran is concerned. And the Syrian regime wants to open up to the Arab world. We saw Mr. Assad visiting the UAE twice, if I'm not mistaken. Now, as a result of the recent agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Saudis are now allowed to approach the allies of Iran in this region, and one of them being the Syrian regime. and we see the Saudis are trying to bring the Assad regime out from the cold. And as we all know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The Saudis want to get involved in Syrian economy. The UAE wants to get involved with the Syrian economy, and that will come at a cost to the Iranian economy. The Iranians have had plenty of experience in Syria with regards to their competition over the years, especially since the civil war, with Turkish products. When there are many Turkish products which are competitors to everyday products Iran sells to Syria, but the Iranians have seen firsthand how when the Syrian shoppers go to the supermarkets, they don't care which country is producing the product, if it's a supporter of the Assad regime or not. What they care about is the price and the quality. And the price and the quality of Turkish products have beaten Iranian products, and Iran has been losing the market to the Turks. And now if the Saudis and if the Emiratis enter, which could be the case, Iran is going to lose out more. So the Islamic Republic of Iran is in fact concerned, and that's one of the reasons why Mr. Raisi was sent to Syria.
Indeed. Mr. Kizilchik, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, of course, also from the prism of Ankara. To what degree is the Turkish leadership concerned by the fact that Iran is technically not only on its eastern border, but also on its southern one?
So from the Turkish position, it's a quite difficult position. Turkey has to live with Iran, even though Turkey doesn't love Iran at all. And Turkey is engaged actually in a quadruple meeting together with Russia and talks with Damascus as well, trying to normalize relations. And we know that Iran was not part in the beginning of these talks. It was just a three-party negotiations, but Iran forced its way into it, just Iran did years ago with the Astana process. So Iran is always a spoiler actor, always a counterbalance against Turkey, always a rival against Turkey. And there's always this golden rule: wherever Iran is, Turkey isn't; wherever Turkey is, Iran isn't. And therefore, Turkey is now seeing how all of this will evolve. Turkey is hoping to find a rapprochement with the Assad regime due to its own domestic political considerations, namely the Syrian refugees, the hope to send them back, which I personally attest to be a myth and which will be a big failure from the part of Ankara. However, this is the policy in Ankara at the moment. And here I have to underline that I'm not that optimistic that the Arab states will be able to counterbalance Iran, or that they will be a real competitor, because Iran is playing the long game in Syria for some years now. Iran has indoctrinated the entire bureaucracy of the Assad regime. Iran controls the military apparatus of the Assad regime, except for some special units supported by Russia. Iran is everywhere in Syria, and Iran has expanded its military and social and demographic presence in Syria to such an extent that the Arab states will not be able to compete with it. And just a competition on an economical level will not be enough. Iran has not gained economically from Syria so far, and they can live on not winning economically in Syria if they can supply the Hezbollah in Lebanon, if they can expand their Shia militias presence in Syria, and if they can deploy long-range missiles or mid-range missiles into Syria, which they have been trying over recent years. Israel was so far successful achieving this, but I wonder how the Israeli airstrikes will continue in the future if the Assad regime is even more normalized, even more legitimized by the Arab states of the region.
Mr. Oren?
In trying to expand on what Omer just said, the special interest that Iran has in Syria compared to other parties is that it does not only want bilateral relations with Damascus or investments and profits from whatever is happening with the Syrian infrastructure, if it is reconstituted following the end of the war, but it wants to use Syria as a launching pad into other parts of the Middle East. And this is special because the Russians or the Turks or the Saudis or the Emiratis have a lot of interests, but only within Syria. Iran wants to exploit its presence in Syria for other ends. And Omer said that Iran has indoctrinated the Syrian military. It has done even more than that. It is indoctrinating Syrian youth, school children. If it goes on and on, in a few years, many Syrian graduates of high schools will have been indoctrinated. Now, when Israel strikes Iranian targets or Iranian proxy targets in Syria, it doesn't regard these schools, these madrasas, whatever, as legitimate targets. It only hits military targets. But the real danger, what Amir called the long game in Syria, comes from the dawah, from the welfare, from education, from the non-lethal practices, which in the long run could turn very lethal.
As part of something that has been, of course, around for millennia, of course, Iran has been very active on the demographic front, something that I touched base on at the beginning, and I think all of us discussed, whether it be in Iraq, where it utilized Hashd al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, to try and drive Muslim or Sunni Muslim populations from certain territories and swap them with Shiite Muslim populations. We see this more and more occurring, of course, in Syria, where Iran, under the strain of the economic sanctions imposed on it by the West, is able to then provide various proxies, of course, lands, providing houses that were formerly of Syrians from who ultimately also had to flee and left Syria, be it to Turkey or elsewhere. Ultimately, Iran is trying to reestablish its culture by inserting more and more Shiite populations in the Syrian territory. To what degree is this methodology that the Iranians have adopted for the long haul, or is this now something that is just in order to meet the needs, so to speak, Dr. Javed Anfal?
You know, I'll be honest with you. It seems on the one hand, what you're saying is that they are doing population change. I don't know if that's going to be stable. It's going to bring stability in the long run for Mr. Assad, because these people are going to come from Pakistan or Iraq or Shia communities in Syria. They will still be foreigners. At the same time, Mr. Bashar al-Assad wants to rebuild Syria. And this is where I differ with Omer in Ankara. The economic aspect is important because maybe not as much for Iran, but it is important for Mr. Bashar al-Assad, because he knows he's not going to have stability unless all these towns that are destroyed and all this infrastructure that has been destroyed is rebuilt. And Iran does not have all the funds to rebuild them, and certainly Iran cannot do it on credit. According to one estimate from Dr. Falahat Pishe, who is the former head of the National Security Council in Iran's parliament, Syria owes Iran $30 billion. $30 billion. The Syrians don't have money. So this is where, again, the Saudi and Emirati influence could be detrimental to Iran's interest. Of course, it's not going to eliminate Iran's interests, but the Saudis, by providing loans and grants to the Saudi regime, to the Syrian regime, they will increase the influence in Syria. And then on the back of this money, they're going to use their own money that they're going to give to the Syrian regime, probably to bring their own companies to rebuild Syria. And I think that's going to give even more leverage to these Persian Gulf countries. And I think this will be against the interests of the Iranians. Of course, Syria is in the grips of the Iranian regime. Iranian regime has a lot of influence there. But I think with these developments, with these Persian Gulf countries now entering Syria, that's going to undermine Iran economically, especially. And in the long run, it could give these countries more say over Syria's political considerations in the future.
Mr. Oskizilchik?
So first of all, I'm quite looking forward to understand how funds and financing investments from the Gulf countries to pay off the debt of the Assad regime to Iran will weaken Iran economically. I don't understand that. And secondly, I do not think that Assad regime has a genuine interest in rebuilding Syria. the first and foremost interest of the Assad regime is to maintain its bases. And here, the demographic aspect is also important. As we know, currently, Syria is divided into three. The oppositional areas have an increase of population from 1.5 million to approximately 5 million. The YPG areas remained at a stable 3 million. And the areas of the Assad regime have lost 30%, almost half of its population, and is now approximately 8.5 million people there. And if you have strategically located people, if you indoctrinate and infiltrate institutions, the bureaucracy, you control the state. And so far, I always joke, the Arab states are speaking with the Assad regime to limit Iranian influence in Syria, and the person they are speaking to is an Iranian agent, and they work for Iran because, for instance, Faisal Mikdad, he was put into his position as foreign ministry by Iran. It was an inside job of the Iranians, and there are much more personas the Iranians have supported and established in the state apparatus of the Assad regime. And here, I think from the past, we can learn as well. Before the war in Syria even broke out, the Arab states and the Gulf states were not quite successful in limiting the Iranian presence in Syria. And they did not well on counterbalancing Iran in Syria. And now, after all of these years, after Iran has entrenched itself, how will they succeed? It's a big question I don't think the Arab states are capable of doing. And last but not least, this argument that Arab states can counterbalance Iran in Syria by engaging with the Assad regime was pushed forward mainly by the United Arab Emirates, the state in the Gulf, among all Gulf states, who has the warmest relations with Iran. So it always wonders me how genuine and sincere these arguments are.
Dr. Javed Anfar, your response?
Thank you. In terms of Syria's debts to Iran, the argument I'm making is that the more, this is one of the reasons why it's very important that they get most of the contracts in Syria, because they want to recoup some of their debts from the Syrian regime. And if companies from the Persian Gulf countries enter and take some of the projects that would go to Iran away, and for themselves, that would come at a cost to Iran at a time when Iran is in financial straits and it needs every dollar that it can get. And I think this is the most important issue. Nobody's talking about replacing Iran. What I'm referring to is reduction of Iranian influence. Nobody's saying that Assad's going to turn against Iran. At this point, he can't do it. He's dependent on them for ground forces. But Assad, I believe, that wants to rebuild the country because he wants to stabilize his regime. And I think that any influence that the Persian Gulf countries can have through their economic might in Syria and economic influence, that will translate into also political influence. And I think both economic influence and political influence, as limited as they may be, I think that will not be in the interest of Iran.
Mr. Oskizilchik, your response?
Okay, I personally think that this reduction of Iran will come to a much higher cost because the more the Assad regime is legitimized, the harder it will be to strike Iranian proxies in Syria, the harder it will be to strike Iran in Syria, as the Assad regime will more and more considered as a legitimate actor in the region. And we know that the stronger the Assad regime has become over the recent years, the stronger Iran has become. And I do not think that we can differentiate between the puppet and the puppet master. If the Assad regime gets stronger in Syria, Iran gets stronger in Syria, and it will be harder for Israel to target Iranian targets. And I also expect that Iran will become a much bigger threat towards Turkey, who is now trying to normalize relations with Assad regime. Let's say, what if these talks fail and we have a new escalation dynamic in which Arab states have normalized with the Assad regime, and Iran can use its full military might against Turkey in Syria and will threaten Turkey. As we know, Iran has also a military presence close to the Turkish borders. So therefore, I am very, very skeptical about the current process.
Very interesting indeed, Mr. Oren.
Well, Iran, Turkey, the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf countries, Israel, these are all regional powers. There are the greater powers, the United States, China, Russia, And one wonders whether what we see now as an American-led bloc against the two other bigger powers, China and Russia, perhaps China dominating, Russia playing second fiddle. How does that fit into what happens in Syria, including the Iranian influence? Because up to now, when Syria is told by the Arab countries that all foreign forces should leave it, Assad usually responds, I have invited Russia and Iran. All the others are interlopers, are invaders, but these two I want to stay. And one wonders what will happen when Russian and Iranian interests collide.
Of course, it was quite interesting. First of all, Deputy Spokesman of the U.S. State Department, Vedant Patel, noted quite openly, of course, the United States stance, where it will not normalize relations with the Arab Republic of Syria, and it will, of course, continue to engage with the United Nations under UN Security Council Resolution 2254. But at the same time, we hear the Arab League, which usually has been more acquiescent to Washington's request, a different tone this time. While it does request, of course, that the normalization with Syrian regime of President Bashar Al-Assad will be normalized within the context of UN resolutions, international law, and other aspects thereof, we do see that the Arab League has already made that interim step where the foreign ministerial already adopted the reinstatement of the Assad regime into the Arab League, and we know that whatever is temporary is ultimately going to hold.
Well, you know, the Arab League, of course, has to work with a broad consensus common denominator. Even more important is the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the moderate Arab bloc under American auspices. And they, too, have decided that they want Syria back, even though it is still radical.
Indeed. Well, one thing that I find quite interesting, and I'm curious to hear your perspectives about this, is the matter of fact that Iran ultimately also seeks not only to counterbalance Israel, but it seeks to counterbalance Turkey. One of the main equations here is, of course, Turkish presence in Azerbaijan, the close pact between the two countries on the northern front, which may have some consequences on that front. Does Iranian presence and aspirations to bolster its presence in Syria seek to counter that equation as well? Dr. Javed Anfa?
The Iranians see the Turks as uninvited guests in Syria. They're competing with them in Azerbaijan. There's a link. Of course, it's a very unwelcome intrusion, the way they see it, of Turkey into Azeri affairs. Iran now basically has two borders with Turkey now. One is the Iran-Turkey border, and now the other one is the Iran-Azeri border. The Azeris have very good relations with the Turks. President Erdogan also said this poem about Turkey, Azeris longing to be reunited with their brothers across the Aras River, which drove Iranians crazy, and I can understand that. So in Syria, they see basically the Turks also as uninvited guests who want to influence the issue in Syria, the matters in Syria. But, you know, the way Iran treats Turkey is very different. Iran has to be very, very careful in the way it handles its relations with Turkey. Turkey is a very important country. Until now, it's been a main source of income, one important source of income for Iranian gas exports. Much of the Iranian non-oil exports transported via land from Europe have crossed over Turkey. Iran cannot mess with the Turks. That's one cat the Iranians don't want to mess with. So they compete with the Turks. They sometimes even, take counter actions in order to counterweight the Turks, but they have to be extremely careful, especially now that after the 2020 war in Azerbaijan, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the Azeris have liberated lands that's basically the Iran-Armenia border. And if the Azeris build the Zangezur corridor, which connects all the way across the border between Iran and Armenia, Iran will lose its border to Armenia. So that means that's another border Iran has lost to the Europeans, to the Turks via the Azerbaijanis. So the Iranians have to be very careful. Can I just make one point here about the issue of China?
We actually don't have very much time. Unfortunately, we have roughly 1 minute left for Mr. Oskizilchik, so I'd like also to hear his perspective on this matter. Go ahead.
So we know that Iran wants Turkey to go out of Syria, and it was also recently stated by the Iranian officials that they want to see Turkey out of Syria. And now they are trying to negotiate this with Ankara. And we know that the Turkish elections will be an important factor here. We know that the Turkish position has always been saying that they want to leave Syria, securing some guarantees, and the Turkish ruling party had an approach of staying in Syria until a political solution is being reached. So Iran will try to use the domestic political landscape in Turkey for its own benefit, and the benefit of Iran is to enforce Turkey to withdraw from Syria. Once Turkey withdraws from Syria, I think that Iran will have a much more easier hand and will gain much more in the region, and will try actually to use Syria to counter Turkey's success and victories in Azerbaijan.
And do you see this happening, actually, Turkish withdrawal anytime soon?
So I do not think that the Turks can withdraw because of the huge population there. I wrote about this. There are 5 million people living in the Turkish protected areas. If Turkey withdraws, all of these people will flee towards Turkey, and this is something the Turks cannot do, even if they would like to do. But this is something the Iranians will push for, and I'm always afraid that there might be a new military escalation in which we might see a new humanitarian disaster in northwestern Syria.
Which you, of course, mentioned in your last report, which you published, which I happen to have read, among others. But unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Dr. Javedan Far, Mr. Oskizilchik, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until next time, shalom.